Thank you very much, and hello to all my friends online. I think a lot of the folks online, I just had a quick look at the participants, and I think I know many, many personally. So thank you very much for supporting me. It's a great privilege to be asked to give this talk, and I actually think it's more important than I thought about at the time when you asked me. But as I did some investigation, and I'm going to share some of those thoughts with you. Overall, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Andrew MacPhail's life, the context in which he wrote the medical history, and then we'll look at the history as much as we can, given the circumstances and of time restraint, and review how it was received at the time and how it's considered today. So I'm going to jump into something familiar, although punch is not familiar to us at all these days. Partly I'm putting it up because it does describe how different the people were 100 years ago. They didn't talk the way we talk. They didn't write the way we write. Their sense of humor was entirely different. And even if you think that punch during the war had a kind of hysterical component, and you might see some origins for something like Monty Python, it's still a very, very different type of publication than we'd be used to. Now, in this particular issue, there's a cartoon there that we might understand in which an older soldier is on duty and a pompous officer is asking him what are his orders, and he's saying, I'm to guard public buildings and prevent air attacks. And we might understand that. And over on the far right side, actually on my own here, I find it very hard to see. Let's see. Yeah, that's easier. On the far right side, you'll see that there's strange sorts of humor that we wouldn't understand. A chat between Scylla and Charybdis would be totally incomprehensible to us. And on the far right column is a series of jokes of humorous toys for children. In the middle is the influenza doll with red eyes and a runny nose. And at the bottom is the dentist with the entire outfit, including forceps, gags, and gas bags. And it'll help baby with teething. And for a little extra money, you can get a drill and some old illustrated papers for the waiting room. And at the bottom is a totally lame joke about, will this war bring us to Kidderminster? And in the middle, of course, and those of you who knew about this knew it was coming, is in Flanders Fields. And you'll notice that it's published anonymously. And to be quite honest, I think it would have died there in that obscure journal and in that page had it not been for Andrew MacPhail. So Andrew MacPhail, when he was shown the issue and the poem, he claimed he was shown it. I think he probably read it like everybody else. When you're at the front, you were reading everything, including what was written on tin cans and everything. But he read it and recognized immediately that it was by John McCrae. And because of Andrew MacPhail, we know the poem today. Now, Andrew MacPhail had good reason to know that it was John McCrae who written the poem, because he both he was familiar with John McCrae and his writing. He was a very good friend of his, both for literary reasons and for medical reasons, which I'll show you later. And he had included John McCrae in a book of an anthology of poems that he was preparing since 1902 when his wife died. And it was a melancholy collection of poems, but it was in 1916 a very appropriate time, he thought, to publish it. It includes poems that he himself wrote, that his brother Alexander MacPhail wrote, and that some colleagues that he knew, such as Rudyard Kipling, wrote, as well as some classic poetry. Now, John McCrae died in January of 1918, as you know, and it was a great shock to all his friends and his family and all his colleagues, and a great loss. And MacPhail was asked to collect his poems, and he did that in this small volume with an essay of character. And in looking at that essay, one line struck me, which I'll highlight for you here, that the inner history of war is written from the recorded impressions of men who have endured it. And I think that's going to be a very important sentence when we review the history that MacPhail would come to write. He is saying here that there's an inner history and implying there's an external history. And inner histories may be different depending according to the impressions of those who experienced the war. The external history is shared, and it probably can be modified over time. Now, I am very grateful to the biography by Ian Ross Robertson for the life of Andrew MacPhail, and many of the much of the information that I'll share with you comes from that book. I'm also very grateful to the Homestead for sharing their information online. And the picture here from their website is of MacPhail's homestead, where he grew up with his 9 brothers and sisters on a small family farm in Orwell, Prince Edward Island. And it was a hard life, but his father was not a farmer. His father was a teacher. And they used to joke in the MacPhail family that the MacPhails didn't have to work. And by that, they meant that the MacPhails were all teachers, and they were teachers going back for generations in Scotland prior to coming to Canada. And they continued that tradition in Canada. But the salary for a teacher wasn't great. And his father felt that he needed another source to sustain his large family. And they had this homestead where all the children worked throughout their period growing up. But the family was very successful. With this large family in the late 19th century, virtually all the children received extended education after high school. So that was quite a remarkable achievement at that time. Initially, Andrew MacPhail wanted to be a teacher, or at least he was a teacher, whether he wanted to be or not. And he had trained in the classics, in the typical curriculum of the advanced education of the day. And he was a teacher doing small locum sort of jobs. And he was in Malpeque, where he met a doctor who impressed him greatly. And the library, as the doctor had, was what really impressed him. And the doctor gave him access to that library, which he said he read every single book in the library. But it, I think, formed his idea that he would become a doctor too, and he went to McGill. By the time he got to McGill, he had some savings, but these quickly ran out. And for his period as a medical student, he sustained himself and paid for his fees by writing articles in the local newspapers. And he was so successful doing that by the time he graduated, he had an income, a reasonable middle-class income from writing, and no debt as a medical student. And he even had secured a contract for a syndicated column to describe a trip around the world. And this was just when he graduated. Now, in McGill, he met Geoffrey Burland, and he became a very good friend of his. And through Geoffrey, he met Georgina, his sister, and they became an item. And I think it was a love match. Andrew completed his tour of the world, and when he came back, he felt financially secure that he could propose, and they were married the next year. They immediately went on another holiday to Europe, so they were doing quite well. But Georgina and Geoffrey came from a very wealthy Montreal family. Their father, Mr. Burland, had multiple businesses, including a business where he printed the banknotes for many banks in North America. So they were literally printing money. And the wedding present that he gave the couple was a house on Peel Street in Montreal. So it was a very good start. And in this house, Andrew started his medical practice, as was very common in those days. He may have had a separate entrance for patients. I'm not 100% sure. The house is gone now. They had two children, Jeffrey, the elder son, and Dorothy, the daughter. Unfortunately, a couple of years after Dorothy was born, Georgina got sick and died. And you can see here, this is the front room of their house in Montreal. A very wealthy house, I suppose, for the time. We would consider it maybe, a middle-class home. And here Dorothy is in her coffin with all the flowers. I think Dorothy's death certainly changed MacPhail, but he was very successful in bringing his children up as a single parent. He had the help of his brothers and sisters, and they would go to Prince Edward Island every summer. So they grew up knowing the Prince Edward Island community very well. Now, in addition to being a doctor, MacPhail was a literary man, and he wrote considerably throughout his life. He changed from being a newspaper journalist to being an author of essays. And he was part of the Pen and Pencil Club in Montreal, where many of the literati of the day, including John McCrae, were members. And they got together and thought they should have a magazine of thought that would be worthy of Canada, to show off Canada within the British Empire and in North America. And to have a place for the publication of serious discussion regarding Canada. And that was the University magazine. It lasted for a little over 20 years, and I'm showing you the last issue there. At the same time, he was the managing editor of the Montreal Medical Journal, and he was really the editor. It says edited by there, and you can see a list of names, some of whom will become familiar in the talk, including George Adami, Blackadder, who became the editor of the Canadian Medical Association Journal after MacPhail, and John McCrae. But they're really the editorial board. The hard work was all done by Andrew MacPhail. In 1911, the Montreal Medical Journal merged with the Maritime Medical News, and they formed the Canadian Medical Association Journal. And this became a very successful journal for which Andrew MacPhail was the founding editor. It's still the premier medical journal in Canada today. When the First World War broke out, Jeffrey, his son, was 19 years old, and he volunteered immediately. His brother, Alex, was an engineer on faculty in the university, in Queen's University, and he signed up immediately as well. Andrew also volunteered, but he was declined on health grounds. He was older, and he had an injury to his left eye, I think, in which a glass fragment had gone in, and he was partially blind. However, he appealed to the Prime Minister, whom he knew personally, and Robert Borden found an exception for him, and he joined up. Now, rather than give him an administrative job in an office away, and maybe to use even his talents better, he ended up at the front. This was almost certainly Andrew MacPhail's request. And he was assigned to number 6 Canadian Field Ambulance with the 2nd Division of the Canadian Corps. So he was at the front for nearly 2 years. He witnessed all of the serious battles that the Canadians had to fight, and he treated thousands of patients with very serious injuries. After 2 years, he was withdrawn and put on staff in the command for the 2nd Division, where he had more time and he did less patient care. And during that period, he wrote articles for the medical journals in Britain, and he gave a very prestigious lecture known as the Cavendish Lecture. He was at the invitation of William Osler and Rudyard Kipling that he gave that lecture, and he was very well known to both of those men. He considered them his colleagues. This picture is taken of the two brothers and Geoffrey when Geoffrey was 21. And I think you will agree that there's a haunted look in all of their eyes. The dog was Andrew's, that he used as a social support. And unfortunately, the dog was killed, which was another crisis that he faced through the war. By the end of the war, he was exhausted. And he returned home to Peel Street in Montreal. I don't think he opened his practice again, but he did see occasional patients. And one patient that he was seeing was severely disturbed. Now, I don't know if it was as a result of the war or what was the cause, but this person broke into the house after seeing him with a pistol and shot him. So he was severely injured with shots to his chest and his right axilla, where the nerves to his arm were injured. He suffered pain for the rest of his life, and his arm, his writing hand, was affected. But the time after the war was not pleasant for really anybody in Canada. The government of the day of Robert Borden had become deeply unpopular. They had survived a very divisive election in 1917, I think, and as a consequence, after the war, they were feeling threatened. They were also feeling seriously threatened as constitutionally, let's say, from several quarters. There was the demobilized troops who could not find jobs. There were workers who felt that their sacrifices through the war were not being rewarded with proper wages after the war. And this is a picture of the riot in Winnipeg. There were officers from the army who were beginning to organize, and there was the constant criticism that they were receiving from the backbench from the former minister for the militia, Sam Hughes. So all of this was combining to make a very threatening atmosphere for the government in Canada at the time. The picture here is often described as the Northwest Mounted Police charging the rioters, but in actual fact, if you look at it carefully, it's the police retreating as fast as they can from the rioters. Several of the horses have lost their mounts, and at least one horse has two riders on it. So you can see the very difficult times that were in Canada when MacPhail was asked if he would write the medical history. I think for MacPhail, the request to write the medical history was a great savior. He was probably in a bit of a fug after the war, and this reinvigorated him. Now, I'm just going to take a little break from that timescale and come to today, really to try and put some of what we're going to talk about in context. I'm also going to declare my own preference, I suppose, in this discussion that's coming. Like MacPhail, I was older when I joined the Canadian Forces and when I deployed overseas. I was also a member of faculty of a Canadian university. And like MacPhail, I was an editor of a journal, the Canadian Journal of Surgery, which is also published by the Canadian Medical Association. And for the centenaries that we were experiencing that Louise alluded to, I thought we could have a series of articles. And for these articles, I asked deployed medical officers or medical officers who had deployed to partner with members of their faculty in the university and write about a topic that affected their university during the war. And we tried to observe some of the times for those anniversaries. You'll note the fifth title there, Organization of the German Army Medical Service. That was actually written by our German colleagues who were deployed with us in Iraq at the time. And the last article, the role of General Sir Arthur Currie in the development of academic medicine in Canada, refers to Arthur Currie as president of McGill. And I was very pleased that I was able to recruit Jack Hyatt to write that for us. Now, just a couple of those articles which will help us understand a little bit of this history. I realized that with that scheme that I had, that we had skipped Vimy, and that centenary was coming up, and I didn't want to miss it in our series. So I collected as much information as I could and brought it with me, and I actually wrote this article when I was deployed. And the majority of the information that I got for this article came from MacPhail's history. And this is how a lot of people look at the history. Rather than read it from cover to cover, you'll look at some element within the history that you're interested in at that time. Now, for the article on Vimy Ridge, I was astounded at the level of detail that MacPhail was able to impart. He told us everything about the organization of the medical service throughout that campaign. He had all of the numbers. He told us where the sites of each of the medical units were, how the evacuation was affected. He even had details like frantic phone calls that were made from the front back to command to say that the evacuations had stopped and that they were overrun with injured soldiers. And what had happened was the medical vehicles that had been, the vehicles that the army had reserved for medical evacuation had been taken and seconded for supplying ammunition to the front. And new vehicles were found, according to MacPhail, and the evacuation lines opened up again. Another article which I think I'll emphasize here because it's critical to the way MacPhail wrote this history, and it's critical to the discussions that occurred after it. And that was the Canadian Army Medical Corps affair of 1916. And in this article, Major General J.R. Bernier and I wrote about the forgotten Surgeon General, Guy Carleton Jones. We felt that Carleton Jones was unfairly treated during this affair, and it had eclipsed his career to the point that we all forgot about him. I actually didn't know anything about the Canadian Army Medical Corps affair until quite recently. Before that article, General Bernier did, and he was very keen that we try and review it. And what I'll say we did was we looked at the crisis. And what happened was that in 1916, articles were written in the Toronto newspapers to say that Canadian soldiers were being mistreated in hospitals in Britain. And it became clear that this was from a speech made by the Minister for the Militia, Sam Hughes. And that a review had been undertaken by Herbert Bruce, a surgeon from Toronto, who was sent out as a special inspector. And he was reporting to a thing called the Sub-Militia Council. And his report was damning, saying that there were multiple deficiencies. As a consequence, Guy Carleton Jones was recalled to Canada, and Bruce was placed in his stead as commander of the medical services. Well, chaos ensued, and very quickly there was an intervention, probably through the British, but maybe through Canada as well, where there was a review of the review. And General Bapty, a Victoria Cross winner, chaired that review, in which they reversed all of the decisions made in the Bruce review. And Guy Carleton Jones was restored as Surgeon General, but he didn't last long. He was recalled to Canada because his career was severely damaged by the whole affair. All of this occurred during the Somme campaign, when there were huge numbers of casualties, and doctors like MacPhail were out there looking after all of our wounded. I think General Bernier will agree with me, thought that this was a terrible betrayal of the medical services that had occurred for political reasons. And when we went through the items that were called by Bruce as deficiencies, we found them all to be trivial and to be hostile and to have no relevance to the good performance of the medical corps. We'll go to the histories of the medical corps in the First World War, and I'll start with Frank McKelvey's effort. He was a medical officer who was with the 1st Canadian contingent to go to France. And he wanted to write about it, but he knew that the censor wouldn't allow him. So he said he covered it with a thin veneer of fiction. Well, the veneer was either thin or it was totally opaque, because his result is kind of a romance that has seemingly no relevance and virtually no information about the Canadian Medical Corps in France. And McKelvey Bell, who was back in Canada in Halifax when the explosion occurred, also attempted to write a history of that event. And again, he wrote this extraordinary thing, a romance of the Halifax disaster, in which he grafted the Evangeline story onto the Halifax explosion. And again, it's totally meaningless in understanding what happened medically. But he did include photographs of the aftermath of the explosion. So for readers, it must have been a most bizarre experience to read this thing. George Adami, whom I mentioned, was a pathologist in Montreal, and he was the mentor for John McCrae. And the two of them had written a textbook of pathology prior to the war. George Adami volunteered, and he was given an office job in the office of the Surgeon General overseas as the ADMS in charge of records. And he wrote the first attempt at a history up to the autumn of 1915. He started it with a good introduction to the history of the medical corps prior to the First World War, and then the preparations for war, and then the description of what they did up to 1915. And to some extent, MacPhail followed the pattern that Adami had created. Prior to the publication of MacPhail's history, this history came out from Colonel Snell about the last 100 days of the Great War. And I'm at a loss to know what was in the head of the organizers to allow this history to come out prior to MacPhail's. It really didn't add very much to anything, but it did describe in detail the organization of the medical corps at that time. And that part of the book is often referred to as a good manual for those who wish to continue this type of this care if it was needed in war again. So if we look at what we had at the time, in 1916, the Canadian War Records Office was started by Max Aitken at the request of the Minister for the Militia. And he and Hughes managed to get General Cruikshank to organize the records. This was rolled over into the historical section at the end of the war under the command of Colonel Dogood, who was a veteran, a decorated and very brave man during the war, and his job was to be in charge of the historical section afterwards. His work is very controversial because the historical section almost ceased to produce anything for years and years after the war, though they did go on to collect as much information as they could. I've described some of the early histories of the medical service. And in October of 1921, Andrew MacPhail was commissioned by the Privy Council to become the official medical historian. And he was either paid then or maybe on after he produced the biography, $5,000, which was a very reasonable, it was a very good sum in those days, equivalent to about $60,000 today. His book was written early, but it wasn't published until 1925. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then in 1977, Colonel Nicholson wrote another history of the Royal Army Medical Corps, in which he also described the service during the First World War. Colonel Nicholson probably rescued the historical section, as he was very prolific, writing about the Canadian Army and the various services. But this was much later. In 1921, after he got the commission, Andrew MacPhail set to work, and he was well known for being able to be very focused and very dedicated. And he worked solidly for 200 days, and he completed the first draft of the history. He wrote it himself, but he had the help of the historical section with access to all of the papers and probably with access to people who helped him collate all of the statistics. There was a delay in the publication, and there's been speculation why that occurred. It was pretty typical of the historical section to be very slow about publishing anything, but it was suggested more recently that it was published because MacPhail continued to pressure them to publish it, and the chief of the army staff at the time said that we should publish it, because if we don't, MacPhail will publish it on his own. I don't actually believe that reason, because if there was under pressure and the government did not want to publish this history, they could let MacPhail publish it on his own. It'll be just as good. It'll be MacPhail's history, and they wouldn't have to bear any burden of responsibility. But they did accept that it was the official history, and it was published with all of the imprimaturs that you see on the screen there. The other thing that we haven't taken into account is that the army would be quite pleased with this treatment of the medical services, I think, because it really brings to bear the responsibilities of the civil authorities and the military authorities. And that was going to be very important to the army. Also, there was a change in government, that now it was the Liberal government under Mackenzie King, and they would be delighted to put out something that maybe undermined their predecessors. But for whatever reason, it was published as the official history, and therein lies a lot of controversy. The very first chapter of this history, MacPhail lets be known what he's about. In this first paragraph, the last line is that armies of an alliance must become one and indivisible, animated by a single spirit. And what he's referring to there was the effort by the Minister for the Militia, Sam Hughes, to make the Canadian medical services, to restrict their activities to caring for Canadians, and for all Canadian soldiers to be looked after by Canadian hospitals and physicians and medical services. Well, it was impossible then, and all of us who have deployed since then in the Second War and all the wars since then, including Afghanistan and Iraq, can attest that that's impossible, that it only works if you're in an alliance, if you have a true alliance where you become, as MacPhail said, one and indivisible. The next thing that MacPhail said is that there was a fatal error which arose out of a failure to separate civil and military functions. And then the last sentence here is very disturbing. He said, failure to observe this law brought the Canadian Medical Service and the army itself to the verge of disaster, and wrenched the Canadian Constitution so severely that it has not yet recovered from the strain. Now remember, this is published in 1925, even if he started to write those words in 1921. And then he writes that the controversy which culminated in 1916, which ended with the removal of the medical director, his replacement by the inspector general, in the dismissal of that one, and in the temporary reinstatement of the original director, and the final appointment of a new head, under whom complete success was achieved. Had this attempt to segregate the medical service succeeded, the way would have been open for a desperate attempt to envelop the other arms and services within specific lines. And what he's saying here is actually very serious. He is accusing the Minister for the Militia of trying to undermine the authority, the chain of command in the army, and of the authority of the government in what would be considered a type of a coup. When you look at the contents of the history, you will see that it's very well organized along traditional lines. He gives the origin of the service along the lines that Adami did, but he increases it considerably. The assembly in Valcartier comes in for criticism, and the preparation in Salisbury Plain comes in for considerable criticism, but they were close to being disasters. The only good thing that was said about the Salisbury Plain was when rain flooded them out, that it prepared the soldiers and indeed the medical corps for the dreadful conditions that they would have to face in France. He does interweave the various events that occur in the war with descriptions for the reader about things like the field ambulance, about surgery in the field, and about developments. But the main focus is on the events, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele, and I described to you how accurate those descriptions were. He reserves about 40 pages, chapters 13 to chapter 16 for the controversy, and when he goes over it in detail. And then he goes back to describing how everything is organized. And it's a bit like a textbook for military medical officers. He describes diseases that occur in the war, and this is very like a textbook. It would be very useful to further medical officers who could adjust their training for the situations that they would find themselves in war. And then he ends with more about the organization. I would say the descriptions are somewhat deficient with respect to the medical service as they were deployed in the Eastern Mediterranean. He calls that in foreign parts and deals with it in about 4 pages. And then he has the last 100 days in the last 2 chapters on demobilization. Just a couple of things that he does say, which we can get from it, because the statistics have never been challenged, that when we started, there were only 20 medical officers and 102 other ranks with 5 nursing sisters. And during the war, he described how it increased so that there were 1,500 medical officers, 1,900 nursing sisters, and 15,000 other ranks, with an enormous capacity where they looked after over 500,000 cases, of which over 1/3 were casualties. And in Canada, which is often forgotten, there was also an enormous medical effort with 65 medical units catering for over 200,000 patients. And the message from the book is held in that line there: the Canadian medical service never failed. He felt that he had to write a justification for what was being written in the papers in 1916. Well, immediately, Colonel Bruce had a retort published in the Toronto Daily Star. And the Toronto Daily Star could be considered the paper that would favor the side of Sam Hughes. His article is basically a reprise of a book that he had published earlier, which he called Politics in the Canadian Army Medical Corps. However, a much more balanced opinion was given by the parliamentary correspondent to the Globe, in which he described MacPhail as writing with candor and precision. And this particular article, I found it in many other newspapers. It was reprised by other people, always giving credit to Irwin. Other people took aspects of MacPhail's book and discussed that, such as the shoddy contractors from the Windsor paper. And the Toronto Daily Star, even though it was not a fan of MacPhail, and he puts official, as you see here in inverted commas, when they discuss the book itself, they actually do not describe anything that MacPhail says as being an error. They spend the time really trying to defend Sam Hughes, who was at this time dead. He died in 1921. But they say that no doubt Sam Hughes made serious blunders, but it was a time for blundering and everybody was at it here and everywhere. And this type of excusing Sam Hughes is something that reminds me very much of apologists for the current president of the United States. I think we can understand Sam Hughes when we think about what's going on there today. And very like the current president of the United States, Sam Hughes used his business buddies freely throughout the war, giving them positions. He had appointed a man called Colonel John Wallace Carson as his personal representative in Britain when he was back in Canada. What had happened was Borden had given Hughes the option of being either the Minister for the Militia or the commander of the Canadian Corps. And Hughes wanted to be both. He chose to continue as the militia, as the Minister for the Militia, but he sought to undermine the command by having his own representative there. And then this committee, the subcommittee, the sub council committee that reported directly to him through his nephew, that he appointed as its secretary. The Ottawa Citizen took a very balanced approach and called out that it was impossible to have long distance generalship of the army. And the most serious treatment of MacPhail's book was by Wilfred Bovey. Bovey was a lawyer who was a veteran of the war. He went on to be a member of the legislature in Quebec, and he was asked to be part of a committee to investigate the historical section. And he wrote a very long treatise on MacPhail's book, which took everything seriously. But I'll just draw your attention to one chapter. And he asked, why did MacPhail include this in the history of the medical services? Well, it was very important to the medical services, of course, but the justification that Bovey gives is different. He says that the information that was available about the medical services was publicly available, and it was able to discuss the difficulties of 1916 without dispute. The reason for the discussion is to ensure that no government, no minister, and no staff may ever again fall into the errors as ultimately resulted in the resignation. Now, after publishing this, MacPhail continued to write, but he was getting older. He did write a history that was of several personalities in the First World War that was very controversial. And then after his death, this manuscript was found and published by his children. And in it, it's kind of a free-thinking poem where he's obviously older and reflecting on his life. He writes it with the main character being his mother, and he writes it from the perspective of the child himself, looking at his mother. But he quickly morphs from his childhood into adulthood, into the wartime, and into his retirement in PEI. And I like the ending that he gives. His humor is available here for us to see at this point, so near the end. And is that the end of the book or the end of his life? It is right to meet the just reproach of any reader who by chance may read these pages. And then he says, if this devotion gives pleasure to others, I shall be glad. But even if no one is pleased, I myself had pleasure doing it. Stephen Leacock was his very good friend, and he wrote about him at the time of his death. But I want to go on quickly to say that Colonel Nicholson, who wrote in 1977 a reprise, did not dispute any of the material that MacPhail wrote. And in fact, MacPhail is the most commonly cited author for the section regarding the First World War. But Nicholson decided to ignore the crisis of 1916. And I think that was what Canada did afterwards. It was better just to forget about it. It was too much, too dark, and we prefer to remember the good things. Modern reviewers have been much more harsh on Andrew MacPhail. Modern historians tend to dismiss him as an amateur. They said his writing is partial, but I'm afraid that I think they have not read the history properly, nor have they really understood it. And they do publish some of the, quote, some of the negative reviews that at the time where it was thought to inappropriate for an official historian to have washed a lot of unclean linen. And quite simply, the reviewers felt that the official history was not the place for official censure. Well, I actually disagree with them. I think it's actually remarkable that an official history was able to look at the deficiencies and the problems that occurred, as well as giving us an authoritative account of what happened in the war to give us a very sound analysis. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss this, and I look forward to your comments.
Okay, that's okay. I'm going to get my voice back now. Now, what I'm going to ask is we're going to go into the portrait. I'm going to go into gallery view here so that I get a chance to see everyone. And then I'm just going to ask you to find your chat buttons, please. And if you just tap, if you'd like to ask a question, and we'll find you and we'll go from there. So I'm just going to give everyone the opportunity to kind of do that.
Well, thank you very much for that. That was terrific presentation and great slides. I grew up in Ottawa, but my dad worked for Stacey as a senior NCO at the historical section. But I live in Victoria now and do a lot of local military history. Now, in the raising of the the general hospitals across the country, 5 was in Victoria. Was there any political interference in those from people like Hughes?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know about the number 5. I do know about the hospital in London, Ontario, where they volunteered early on. And the universities all volunteered hospitals because they had the medical staff, they had hospitals, and they had a very prominent place within their community. Hughes initially refused them all and said that he didn't want them. He really didn't want that type of person or institution within the medical corps. He wanted to keep it under control. But very quickly, it was evident that we would not be able to recruit in the traditional way to have a pure Army Medical Corps, that we were going to require partnership with universities, and they all came in under the Medical Corps. And I must say, at least from the perspective of the hospitals that I got to know in Halifax and in London, they very quickly adopted military etiquette, and they understood the chain of command very well, and they trained as well as they could. But they were essentially civilians that were co-opted to go overseas. So I think the political interference was that it wasn't part of Hughes's original plan, but he did come to accept it.
Roya, you had your hand up at one point. Would you like to ask a question? Okay, that's fine.
Certainly, Vivian Filipolitsky here. I certainly enjoyed your presentation. As
Thanks,
with
Charlie.
everything that you take on, you do it thoroughly, and it's so clear when it comes through. One of the issues of concern that John McCrae had when he indicated quite clearly that he wanted to be a field commander, not to be in the medical corps, and wanted to command at least a battery, if not several, of artillery. Ultimately, the medical corps got him and basically pulled him from his position at the front to put him in a hospital. What was that all about? Were there so few medical officers that they needed to have McCrae as a medical officer rather than to pursue his own desire not to be?
Well, I think it was John McCrae's wish. He was ambivalent. You're right. He did offer himself, but he did say as either an artillery officer or a medical officer. And his artillery friends told him that he would be useless as an artillery officer. They'd have to train him all over again. He was too far out of training, and it was a very different type of artillery. He was used to taking mobile artillery by horse all around South Africa, and he was very expert at that. But that was not the type of war that they were fighting in the First World War. With respect to his role as a medical officer, it's often said that he preferred to be at the front, but he actually went because the McGill Hospital, which he hoped to be part of, was delayed in deploying, probably due to the Sam Hughes story. But it was delayed in deploying, and he did not want to delay, so he went out with the artillery as their regimental medical officer. So I think that was the reason. There are letters where he was quite angry with Carleton Jones because Jones was delaying in bringing him back from the front to go and join the hospital, the McGill Hospital there. But I think, McCrae was ambivalent. He would have done whatever task. He was loyal, and he would have done whatever task Canada wanted him to do. And they preferred and needed him more as a medical officer. And I think they were right.
Thank you. I enjoyed that very much. I
Ian,
actually,
before you talk, I forgot to mention that you told me that, and I saw that the book was published in 1925 for $2, and that you bought it for $2.50, which is probably just the extra tax from the government publication office in the 70s. So it hadn't gone up in price.
that's right. It was they used to have Information Canada bookstores on St. Catherine
right.
Street in Montreal, and it was $2.50. And then I got the two-volume World War II series for $4.50 each. McCrae, I actually think he was a gunner. His CO of the brigade that he was the medical officer to was his former commander in South Africa. And in 1914, early 15, no one thought there was going to be a trench system. They all thought they were going to be galloping all over Western Europe with the guns and setting up and firing off and setting up again, to the point that they were going to have 6 18-pounders per battery, and they reduced them to 4 because they didn't think a battery commander could control 6 guns at once. Of course, you're all lined up in a trench, you could control a lot more than that. John Keegan, in his write-up of the World War II history, said that the only true history cannot be written until everyone is dead. And the Nicholson history, which came out in 2015 again with a very interesting introduction, discussing briefly MacPhail's book. The original Nicholson book referred to the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps of World War I with a very two-line footnote on page 23, referring you to the book. Do you think that one of the reasons that MacPhail really couldn't come out with a lot of opinions was a lot of the people were still alive?
Yeah,
Ozer
well,
was dead,
actually,
and
you're absolutely right, Ian. And his saying that's attributed to MacPhail along those lines is that I had to write the history as if everybody was dead, and then I discovered that they weren't.
yeah, especially Bruce.
Exactly. Well, I don't know if I'm exaggerating here in that there were a group of people who saw um, Sam Hughes's activities as being seriously threatening to the good order of government in Canada. And I don't know if I am exaggerating here that it was a coup. I don't think Canada would face that sort of risk again, because it's very difficult for ministers to behave that way. And it's very difficult in a parliamentary system to effect a coup that way. But Sam Hughes did have a confrontation with Borden at the very end in 1916. And what had happened up to then was Borden was very nervous of Sam Hughes. And I imagine it like this, that if it's difficult to have Donald Trump as president of the United States, imagine being a prime minister and having him as one of your ministers. It would be absolutely a disaster. And that was the situation for Borden. And he constantly faced the crises that Hughes brought his way by asking friends, and they kept saying, well, maybe we could do this or maybe we could do that. So he'd always offer Hughes an alternative. And this is what happened in 1916. He had met with other members of cabinet, and Borden said that he would offer Hughes the opportunity for another ministry or to go back to the backbenches. And Hughes came back from Britain in a high state of euphoria, thinking that everything was going his way. And then he was confronted by Borden, and then he threatened Borden. And he threatened him with some sort of a threat, a constitutional threat, saying, I have more support than you have, or something like that. And finally, Borden got the backbone up to face him and fire him. And without reaching that stage, this thing could have festered on. I think the reason why it didn't become a coup is that for Hughes, it was really a vanity project. It wasn't really about being the governor of a country in whatever form he imagined it was going to take afterwards, but that he was on some sort of wild vanity project. But I don't know if I'm overreading all of this. There are a lot of historians online, and I'm willing to accept a challenge on this.
Vivian, always outstanding and enlightening. How about his children, Jeffrey and the daughter? Whatever happened to them in this story?
I wasn't able to find a lot out about them. They both got married. Jeffrey had no children, and he died about 10 years after his father. His father died in 1938. Jeffrey died in 1947. And Dorothy inherited the property in PEI, and it had been severed somewhere along the line, either during MacPhail's life or during Dorothy's time, so that when she bequeathed the homestead, it was with less land. And then more recently, the descendants, Dorothy's descendants, the great-grandchildren of MacPhail, actually gave more land to the homestead, so that the original farm is now bigger than it was at the time it was bequeathed. But I don't know a lot more than that about them. But maybe people at the homestead who are online might wish to contribute there, Ken. Nice question, though.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I know I speak for everybody here when we really enjoyed and appreciated Dr. McAlister's talk and insights. Thank you. I should point out that we actually have our just very recently passed president of the Sir Andrew MacPhail Foundation, Alan Stanley, who is remind me of their relation again, Alan?
Great-grandson.
A great-grandson of Sir Andrew.
Thank you.
Yes, and Dr. McAlister is absolutely correct that The Lindsay family did bequeath a very generous portion of land in recent years, which did expand the MacPhail property again. Quite a bit of it is woodland now, and there's wonderful work being done around here by the MacPhail Woods Nature Center in terms of restoring native trees and shrubs and the original Acadian forest. Yes, we're if anybody is interested in learning more about the MacPhail descendants, it's a very large family. And I know you're aware of this. You just wouldn't have had a chance to get into it in your talk, but he had 9 siblings, and correct. And many of them, not all of them, but many of them had children and so on. So it's a very large and very, very interesting family.
There's a lot of us.
Yep. And a member of our Heritage Committee, actually, right now, a gentleman named Brian Corbett, who is also a MacPhail descendant, is actually researching detailed genealogies and family histories of many of Sir Andrew's siblings at the moment.
Wow.
So, yes.
Simon, I read that Andrew and Alex MacPhail ran an experimental farm on the homestead for a long time. Have you any story about that? I think that's an extraordinary thing, that a lot of experimental farms around Nova Scotia and PEI and Ontario, they were very valuable, contributing to the development of farming in Canada. I don't know if there's any interest in opening another one with the land you've got.
Yeah, I believe he brought tobacco to the island.
Yeah.
Tobacco
Yes,
was
yeah.
a huge crop here until it wasn't. And
It's
I was saying that he had, my great-grandfather had brought tobacco to the island. It was a huge crop for a long time. The tobacco farmers did extremely well until the bottom fell out of that completely. There's a whole history in there. And when he had the experimental farm, this has nothing to do with tobacco, he invented or bred a potato called the Orwell Square. And its main feature was that it was kind of flat and packed easily in wooden boxes. I don't know.
Like the square tomato.
Yeah, this is almost the question probably leads to a whole presentation you could do, but it's while we have you here. So the legacy, all these the medical corps coming back to Canada, and of course, you know, they were, as you mentioned, there's a large segment of the medical corps even here in Canada. But what was the legacy? How much did the hospitals and medicine change with all these people coming, medical corps people coming back?
Oh, it changed dramatically. Canada was always on a catch-up sort of mode up to then. We would get trained overseas, usually in Britain at that time. And now the Canadian physicians were over there working with their British colleagues. And people like Jonathan Meekins came back to Montreal and brought back heart specialist cardiology to Canada. The Montreal Neurological Institute is a direct benefit of our participation in the First World War. And throughout Canada, all of the universities were strengthened by the return of these veterans who were knowledgeable. And it really, in the 1920s and 30s, brought Canada up to being equivalent to any hospital or university in Britain or the United States. It gave us a very good footing for the Second World War.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much, Vivian.
Thank you, sir.
Wonderful as always. I just wanted to back you up with the reality that things that Andrew MacPhail was condemning still takes place today. And to devastatingly, potentially horrible effect with the life and death mission and functions of the medical service. So I share your support for his effort at the time, contrary to the criticisms of some of the critics and reviewers of his official history at the time. And despite the political aspects and partisanship, I assume that occurred because of the Mackenzie King's government at the time was not had an interest in denigrating the efforts of the previous Borden governments and the Maine governments. it was important that that point was made. And interoperability and commonality are so critical. They're essential. And most chiefs of defense have recognized that over the years as a result of terrible experience, and particularly for a country like Canada and some of the smaller allies, but even the Germans. Only the Americans can really go it alone with a low density, high specialization service like the medical service. And that's the purpose for which the Committee of Chiefs of Medical Services exists in NATO, of bringing all the surgeons general together in order to establish that very profound degree of interoperability and commonality wherever possible. And it's just a failure. And it was as great a surgeon as Lieutenant Colonel Bruce was, he really didn't know anything about the management at the strategic and operational level of a health system in warfare. And as you all know, Hughes imposed political factors that were deadly in many cases, like the Ross rifle and some of his other political interventions in the structure and the function and the equipment of the armed forces that had ultimately cost lives. So I just wanted to highlight, though, that to this day, there is political interference. We saw it, one of the most devastating effects was most recently in the 1960s with Minister Hellier's threats to Prime Minister Pearson to enact and proceed with unification of the armed forces and all the devastating effects it had, although some of his integration elements were great. And without naming names, because I agree that people who are still alive, things shouldn't be, the dirty laundry shouldn't be aired until everybody involved is dead. But a chief of defense asked me when I left for advice, key points. And one of those 5 key points I highlight for him and that he agreed and fought for was that there be no appointments in the medical services at the senior leadership level driven by any political factor, only by merit and competence. But he was overruled. And there is all governments have done that. All parties do that. One party backs down, or has, in my experience during my service, would back down if it was contrary to military advice, but one would not. And so now I'm only aware of 3 times in history since the establishment of the medical service for the armed forces where political interference led to adverse effects. One was Sir Andrew MacPhail's, the incident Sir Andrew MacPhail recounts. Another one was more recent in certainly during my service, and most recently one since I left. So any push, and historically otherwise, to highlight the need to respect what MacPhail said in his opening paragraphs of the civil authority providing the forces, but its internal management and function operationally being left to people who know something about what they're doing is a critical contribution to the national security of the country and the lives of the troops. Anyway, thanks very much for bringing this up, Vivian, and for this presentation and all of your historical efforts.
Sir, thank you very much for those comments. I mean, they really do add to the context of what we're talking about. I will say that you were the chair of that committee for NATO, and in all the deployments that I had under your command, Canadians went overseas knowing their role interoperably, how to work with their allies seamlessly. And we have Sergeant La Violette there online, many of our medics ended up as the go-to person in all of those multinational units where they knew what was happening. If you went to the radiology department, you didn't look for the American radiologist, you looked for the Canadian tech to know what to do and how to get things done. And that was the story throughout all of our Allied deployments. And I think that's due to leadership of your leadership and your predecessor and successors. And that's why we succeeded and why we were so valued by our allies. And I think it all stemmed from the First World War and the understanding that those people had of their role in an Allied effort. Thank you.
I'm not dead yet, as Monty Python says, so I can't talk about politics. I think that Hughes was declining and falling mainly because of the Brits. The book by Nicholson and published in 1962 goes into great detail on the Ross rifle because everybody's dead. And the British actually, Hughes was threatening to court-martial any CO whose soldiers switched to the Lee Enfield. And the British finally said, no, if you don't take the Ross rifle out of service, we will withdraw the entire Canadian Corps from the line and put you in the back. And that was the end of the Ross rifle, and it was nearing the end of Hughes. Hughes' son, Garnett, was a major general, and he was thirsting after getting Garnett appointed commander of the 5th Division that was just forming in England. And the British said he's incompetent. There's no freaking way. And they actually broke up the 5th Division to supply reinforcements for the beleaguered divisions in France. My grandfather was actually the battery commander, the brigade commander for the artillery for that 5th Division, and he was actually sent over to become commander of the artillery brigade for 2nd Division just before Vimy, because it was being broken up. Anyway, he was declining and falling, but his brother, Sam Hughes' brother, actually commanded a training camp just east of Brandon, which is still, it's a farmer's fields, but it's a historic site. It's well worth the visit if you can find the turnoff. To train troops. They had thousands of them there. They had realistic trenches, artillery. They were doing relief in place, night attacks. It was very innovative and probably saved thousands of lives because of that training. Maybe his brother should have been higher command.
Second, I'll highlight that we've had talks in the past about the effect of the public health by the nurses that came back after the war when the influenza was so prevalent, and the sort of the resonance that had. We've also had a talk on the guinea pig club from the Second World War, and especially the Canadians. There's an excellent book written by an author right here in Ottawa about the guinea pig club and about the stories from the Canadian guinea pigs and about their medical support when they got back to Canada. So we've had a couple of excellent talks sort of around the medical field, but not in this level tonight. This has been quite extraordinary for us. I certainly didn't have any idea of any of this. So this has been a wonderful opportunity for me, Dr. McAlister, and it's opened up things that I'll now peek at. And that's always a nice thing. So certainly thank you all for taking the time to come out tonight with us. I remind you, the Friends of the Canadian War Museum, this year we've donated $100,000 to the War Museum. We support the veteran program for veterans to come park for free and eat for free when they're at the museum. We do all sorts of things with training boxes, bear box type training aids that go to schools on the First and the Second World War. We pay all those shipping costs for that for the War Museum. We've just brought back another vehicle for the LeBreton Flats. We pay the shipping costs for this barge, whatever that is, from Juno Beach. One of the sort of the newer additions to the War Museum. So we're always helping when the museum asks us. We also do an adopt a book program for the reference library, where they put out a list of about 50 books a year that they'd like to put in the reference library. And either friends of the museum or those people who are donating to the museum often adopt the books. So it's a very good way of helping out the reference library as well. So anyway, all that to say, we do that, but at the same time, we won't be back again to the fall. But we encourage you to pay attention. Friends of the Canadian War Museum is just online on Facebook and stuff. It's on LinkedIn. Check on us. You're welcome back to any of the talks. If you're not a member of the Friends, it doesn't matter. So again, special thank you for you all. And Dr. McAlister again, thank you for doing this with us tonight. Thank you again for those of you that are tucked away at the Homestead estate. Thanks you for joining us. And on behalf of all of us that came, we all share a common interest in the past, in the history, and it's nice to be able to have a community practice like that. So thank you again, and we'll say good night, but we won't close this down quite yet to make sure that everybody sees the chats. Thank you again.
Louise, thank you.